Thanks for joining us today for Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our Webinar Wednesday program. We are coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday and are provided complimentary. They're recorded and can be downloaded from our website and YouTube channel, which now holds over 300 of our government contract webinars. In the interest of time, we do not take questions, so if you have questions for our speaker, we will have his information on the last slide of the presentation today. A special thanks to our educational sponsor, the National Veterans Small Business Coalition, for making these webinars possible. The NVSBC is the largest nonprofit trade association for veterans. Please visit their website for more information. So a little bit about us. We work with U.S. federal government contractors, including product, service, and software firms. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance. More information is on our website. We also have opportunities for your organization to advertise in our newsletter. We now reach almost 17,000 subscribers, and this includes both contractors and government. Contact us for pricing information with the email shown on your screen. Okay, and to introduce our speaker, Christoph Minarczyk. Welcome, Christoph. We're glad to have you with us today, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you very much to everybody at Jennifer Schaus and Associates. I'm really happy to be here today to talk about other transactions and the frequently asked questions about these very special types of government contracts. My name is Christoph Minarczyk. I'm the owner of Christoph LLC, and my firm provides consulting to federal contractors, professional training, and also expert witness services. And I'm also happy to announce I recently published a book called Government Contracts in Plain English, which is available on Amazon. So if we move to the very first slide, I'd like to set the scene. What are we going to talk about today? Today, we're going to go over what exactly is an other transaction. I'm going to distinguish other transactions from other types of government acquisition or assistance instruments that you may have heard of. We will also go over, does the FAR apply to other transactions? The FAR, of course, being the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which is the main set of regulations that applies to normal government contracts. We will also go over the main benefits or advantages to using other transactions, and that will explain why other transactions are so popular and why they're becoming more and more frequently used, and you see them and read them more and more in the news about government contracting. And then I'll touch briefly on why some people find other transactions to be controversial, and we'll close with a few research resources so that you can learn more about other transactions on your own. So with that, let's get to the next slide about what exactly is an other transaction. Well, let me set the scene by saying we all know government contracting is kind of slow. It's cumbersome. We all know fighter planes and battleships and major weapon systems, they can take 10 to 15 years to develop and to field for the warfighter. Once that time has passed, the technology that we bought is definitely not state of the art, right? Because the technology state of the art has been moving all along the whole time. So we're also aware that there's many regulations, like the FAR, for instance, many laws, many special accounting rules. And we're probably somewhat familiar with a lot of the intellectual property rules and clauses that are inserted into these government contracts. Well, what if I told you there's another way? What if I told you there's a very special type of a government contract that is exempt from a lot of these regulations, that is exempt from a lot of these unique government cost accounting standards that scares away so many federal contractors, that is exempt from a lot of these intellectual property clauses that also scare away a lot of cutting edge research and development firms? Also, what if I said that these are not entirely, but mostly exempt from the protests, the bid protests at the Government Accountability Office? And then what if I threw in additionally that sometimes these special types of government contracts can be, but are not always, but can be negotiated and awarded much faster than traditional government contracts? Well, you'd be very impressed, wouldn't you? Well, what I'm talking about is the concept of these other transactions. So what exactly does that mean? Why does it have this funny name called other transaction? Well, here's why. An other transaction is in fact defined in the negative. The whole concept of an other transaction was created by Congress by a law where they decided to grant NASA, the space agency, they wanted to grant NASA the ability to conduct contracts and agreements with private industry, with universities, with anybody, in a way that was not a typical procurement government contract, in a way that was not a grant, which is a form of assistance, in a way that was not a cooperative agreement either. So it's not a procurement contract, and that phrase procurement contract is very important. It's not a procurement contract, it's not a grant, and it's not a cooperative agreement. So the reason why that's so important is because all of the rules that I was discussing that make government contracting slow, unattractive to many federal contractors, burdensome regulations, burdensome accounting and intellectual property rules, all that is essentially, rather I should say almost all of that is essentially thrown out the window when you're talking about an other transaction. And that is why it's called other transaction. It really is just an alternative where we have a very clear statutory mandate that an other transaction is not a procurement contract. And the reason we say that, when you think procurement contract, you're thinking of a typical government contract, which would be subject to all those regulations I mentioned. Whereas other transaction is really just a turn of phrase that became a term of art, and it became a legislative authority to do a special type of government contract. But what I want to emphasize to you is that although an other transaction has this special name that makes it sound very interesting, and it is interesting and unique and different and all these things, but you should always remember that indeed another transaction is a contract. It is a legally enforceable agreement between the federal government and a contractor company, or maybe a university or a nonprofit, but it is still an agreement. It is still a legally enforceable contract between two parties. So with that, let's move to the next slide. Big question. Everybody wants to know, does the Federal Acquisition Regulation apply to other transactions? Well, I think you're going to understand already that the answer is no. Other transactions are exempt from the Federal Acquisition Regulation. This is one of the greatest benefits. But I'm going to throw something in there as well. Not only are other transactions exempt from the Federal Acquisition Regulation, they're also exempt from many, many other laws that normally apply to these traditional procurement contracts. So I'll just list a few of them. Other transactions are not subject to the Competition in Contracting Act, or CICA, C-I-C-A. The Competition in Contracting Act is the main legislation that forms the basis of the complicated competition, solicitation, evaluation, and award procedures that lend themselves to highly litigated bid protests. So CICA, the Competition in Contracting Act, does not apply to other transactions. That benefit means that other transactions are not subject, generally, to the same types of bid protests as other traditional procurement contracts are subject to. Another important exemption: other transactions are not subject to the Bayh-Dole Act. The Bayh-Dole Act is named after two legislators that created it, Bob Dole, and I'm not sure of the first name of Mr. Bayh, but the Bayh-Dole Act is the standard intellectual property regime that applies to most government contracting. And of course, this is also something that scares away a lot of tech companies. So other transactions are not subject to that regime, which allows for a lot of flexibility in the negotiation of those intellectual property rights when you're dealing with the government when using an other transaction. Another example, cost accounting standards, or CAS. Cost accounting standards are a huge regulatory burden that any federal contractor familiar with cost reimbursement contracts has heard of and probably dreads. So cost accounting standards is a very tough, unique accounting regime that your company has to essentially pay for in its overhead and hiring to comply with a traditional procurement contract. With another transaction, there is no concern about cost accounting standards. They don't apply. There's many other government contracting laws and regulations that don't apply to other transactions, but foremost among them is, of course, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which does not apply to other transactions. There's plenty of other examples. There's also laws like the Truth in Negotiations Act, which some people call TINA, although the name has changed. That's the law that's requiring you to submit certified cost and pricing data, which requires your company to disclose a lot of proprietary information and subject your company to a lot of risk with the submission of that information and the certification thereof. So these are just a few, but if you research online, you'll be able to find quite a few more of these laws passed by Congress and regulations created by agencies that simply do not apply to other transactions. So let's move to the next slide and learn more. On the next slide, we're discussing what is the benefit of using other transactions. Well, I've led you to the answer to this question by going over some of the exemptions. That is one of the obvious benefits. When you're using another transaction, I want you to consider it to be just like any other contract that you've ever experienced. It's important to remember that although other transactions are unique when compared to government contracts in the traditional sense, you must understand that other transactions give you the greatest amount of freedom of contract. That's one of the greatest benefits of using other transactions. So although there are all these laws and regulations that don't apply, in reality, you're really just confined by the four corners of the contract that you negotiate with the government. So one of the benefits, of course, is flexibility. That's a benefit for you as a federal contractor. Now, what's the benefit to the government? Why does the government like using other transactions? Well, let's take a history lesson back to the 1950s. In the 1950s, the United States was locked into a very intense competition with the former Soviet Union. It was called the space race. And the United States was absolutely shocked when the Soviet Union launched a satellite called Sputnik. Now, Sputnik was not very impressive by today's standards. It was about 2 feet in diameter. It was a polished sphere with simple antenna at the end of it. But Sputnik caused an increase in the competitive level and the seriousness of the space race. This essentially began the space race, and the Cold War followed events like this. Now, the launch of Sputnik was the reason that NASA, our space agency, was initially granted this special type of other transaction authority. They were initially called Space Act agreements because of the law that created it. Now, this was absolutely critical to NASA's history, but what you need to know is that this same other transaction authority that was granted to NASA eventually spread to the Department of Defense at places like DARPA, and now it's also available in all the major services like Air Force, Navy, and Army, and it has also spread to many of the civilian agencies like the Department of Homeland Security. So why did other transactions become so important? Well, let me give you one more little history lesson. Back in the 1950s, research and development for cutting-edge technology in the United States and even globally meant that you were going to one place, the United States government. Uncle Sam was the one who was providing the most money and funding for cutting-edge research and development, largely funded by things like the Cold War and the space race. But if we fast forward to 2020, the world has changed, and the world has changed significantly. The United States government is absolutely not the biggest and best place to secure funding for cutting-edge technology. If you've heard of a place called Silicon Valley in California, or any number of the technology hubs that are in the United States or even globally, you can understand why this is the case. Now, the change in the shift in the distribution from the United States dominating the research and development community to the place we are now, where it is more distributed, both across the United States and globally. That means that the United States government is ever more concerned with reaching out and engaging with and contracting with the best cutting-edge research and development and technology firms. Government has come to realize that to do that, they have to come to terms in ways that are more flexible and more beneficial for these companies, because now the companies have the choice to never do business with the federal government. There's a very large private sector market for research, development, and technology. So in some way, you can view the rise of other transactions as a realization on the part of the United States government that they have to make government contracting easier, more flexible, and in a more advantageous way for both the government and for the private sector counterpart. And other transactions are absolutely one of these tools that attracts things like non-traditional contractors. That's a term you'll hear thrown about, and that just means a company not like Boeing or Raytheon or BAE. Non-traditional contractor refers to the best and brightest technology and research and development firms that are out there, but yet do not do business with the United States government. They usually don't do business with the United States government because of some of the problems I mentioned earlier with procurement, traditional procurement government contracts. They don't want to deal with the accounting rules. They don't want to deal with the federal acquisition regulation. They don't want to deal with the standard rules for disclosure and licensing of their intellectual property. So that's where other transactions come in. And that's why you're seeing the rise of other transactions. As a little point of reference, in 2015, other transactions represented just under $1 billion in spending, and that's billion with a B. In 2019, other transactions spending by the United States federal government rose to $7.5 billion with a B. So this is increasing by multiples over the years. So why are other transactions becoming so much more popular? Well, some might speculate that the United States government is ready to counter threats from emerging competitors like China and Russia, and the United States is realizing that to counter threats like that and to maintain the United States military dominance, they absolutely need to get the best cutting-edge research, development, and technology from the best firms. And sometimes the best firms don't want a procurement contract based on the FAR. In fact, some of these firms want to use other transactions. So let's move to the next slide. And now we're going to talk about why are these other transactions controversial? Well, I've been telling you about the benefits of these other transactions, why they were created, how they're used, who they're meant to attract. But what about the people who don't like other transactions? There are quite a few people who are critics. Many of these critics are government regulators or legislators in Congress. The people who are critical of other transactions do not like other transactions for the very same reason that everybody else does like other transactions. So these are two sides of the same coin. The critics of other transactions would say that because we don't follow the standard rules found in the Federal Acquisition Regulation, because other transactions are exempt from things like the Competition and Contracting Act, because other transactions are exempt from special accounting rules like the cost accounting standards, they would say that this additional flexibility comes at a price, and it comes at the disadvantage of the United States taxpayer. They would argue that all of these procurement and traditional government contracting laws and regulations were put into place to make sure that contractors, quote, stay in line and are highly regulated and can be audited and controlled so that the spending and the costs do not increase too much, and to ensure that the taxpayer gets what they deserve for every dollar that the federal agency spends. Now, I will remain agnostic about this opinion, but I want to throw it out there to let you know that it's something you can read about, and it's something you will see dominate in the news headlines this year, next year, and for time to come. One more reason why other transactions are controversial. Some would say that many of the problems solved by other transactions, such as flexibility, such as attracting non-traditional contractors, some would say you don't need the other transactions, and you can in fact accomplish these goals using traditional procurement contracts like those subject to the federal acquisition regulation. What I would say is that indeed there is a great deal of flexibility found in the federal acquisition regulation, in the FAR. But what I would say is that there are many technology and research and development firms who use a business analysis to look at the regulation and the risks posed by traditional government contracts, and they make a choice to not ever enter into those relationships. In my opinion, that is the reality of the situation, and I base that on years of experience with such firms, with high-level discussions with their senior leadership. I can tell you that there are many companies that do not want government contracts as a prime contractor because they are rightfully concerned with many of the provisions, clauses, rules, and regulations that they would be subject to. For those types of companies, other transactions are a perfect solution. So for that reason, although other transactions are certainly controversial, I do not expect other transactions to disappear anytime soon. I would describe other transactions as one of many tools in the government's toolbox to buy, procure, contract for much needed goods and services, and for, of course, research and development, which is, of course, the purpose for other transactions. So moving to the next slide, what I want to leave you with is, well, how can I learn more about other transactions? Learning about other transactions is much like learning about traditional government contracting. There are a lot of research resources available to you right now for free if you're simply willing to take the time to use the internet or other resources to read and learn about them. I'll share just a few of you as we close this webinar. The first place I would encourage you to look is the constant stream of free articles that are written by law firms and other consulting firms. For instance, Jennifer Schaus and Associates produces quite a bit of material about government contracts, and you're listening to some of that material right now about other transactions. So I would encourage you to read, listen, watch as much as possible. That really is one of the best ways to understand other transactions or any other topic like it. I would also point you to a new website that was created by DARPA. DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, D-A-R-P-A. DARPA released a few months ago a website called acquisitioninnovation.darpa.mil. And this website is dedicated to educating the entire public about other transactions and other types of innovative acquisition that is used for cutting-edge research and development. The website has the background, it has historical examples, and it also has sample documents, which are very useful for you to look at. These sample documents will provide you the skeletal outline of what an actual other transaction agreement, i.e. an actual other transaction contract, would look like. So I'd very much encourage you to look at that. And then finally, something to look at, even if you don't work with the Department of Defense, I would encourage you to look at the Department of Defense's Other Transaction Guide. So they have a huge policy document available that you can Google and find quite easy. And again, although that guidance is for the Department of Defense, that doesn't mean that that guidance won't be very helpful to anybody in the industry who's working with any other agency, because it provides a lot of best practices and a lot of the mechanics of how other transactions work. So I'd encourage you to look at all of those resources to learn more about other transactions. So with that, we'll move to the next slide. So again, I'm Christoph Minarczyk. I'm the owner of Christoph LLC, which provides consulting, training, and expert witness services for government contractors. I'm also the author of Government Contracts in Plain English, which is a book available on Amazon. And if you have further questions about other transactions or any topics in government contracts at all, I'd encourage you to email me at christoph@christophllc.com. And you can get that email address from my website, which is christophllc.com. So thank you very much for tuning in. It was my pleasure.
Thank you, Christoph, for a great presentation and sharing your time with us. Thanks to everyone who joined us. The recording will be on our website and YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. Please join us this Friday as we cover each part of the FAR, and join us next Wednesday for more hot topics in federal contracting.